America just made a move that was meant to put pressure on Canada. But Canada's cold and fearless reply shocked everyone. Instead of looking weak, Canada now looks more independent and ready to build stronger ties with other nations.
Which is the end of 2024. So it hasn't met. It's supposed to meet biannually, but it hasn't met since then. I wouldn't overplay, I mean, it has a long heritage, but I wouldn't overplay the importance of this. Where we have many aspects of very close defense cooperation with the United States, as you know, our closest defense cooperation. I'll give you the example of NORAD, and also put this in context of enormous investments that we're making in NORAD, over $40 billion that we're making in NORAD. $8 billion, one of the first announcements I made as Prime Minister was over $6.5 billion in what's called over-the-horizon radar in Nunavut, which helps protect in hypersonic missiles and others. Investments that we're making.
Elbridge Colby, the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, announced on social media that Washington was pausing the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, the bilateral advisory forum that has governed Canada-U.S. defense cooperation since 1940. Colby claimed Canada had failed to make credible progress on its defense commitments and said the United States can no longer avoid the gaps between rhetoric and reality. He linked his announcement to a transcript of Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, a speech delivered 4 months before the PJBD pause, in which Carney called on middle powers to band together in the face of great powers flexing their muscles. 24 hours later, Carney was standing at a news conference in Quebec, and reporters asked him about the announcement. His response was 3 words that defined the entire Canadian reaction to Washington's move. It has a long heritage, but I wouldn't overplay the importance of this. Carney told a news conference in Quebec when asked about the surprise development. We have many aspects of very close defense cooperation with the United States. That is the full scope of Canada's alarm about the pause of the oldest bilateral defense institution in North American history. Not alarm, not concerned, not a diplomatic statement carefully calibrated to signal distress while maintaining composure. A shrug and a reminder that bilateral defense cooperation continues through many other channels. Carney did not call the move destabilizing. He did not demand a reversal. He did not convene an emergency defense review. He said he wouldn't overplay the importance of it and moved on to announcing the largest graphite mine in the G7. The context that makes Carney's response strategically coherent rather than merely nonchalant is the documented reality of Canada's current defense trajectory. Ottawa and NATO announced this spring that estimates suggested Canada met its alliance defense spending target of 2% of GDP for the first time. Carney said that figure is currently tracking at 2.1%. Canada had not met the NATO 2% threshold under the previous government. The Carney government reached it within its first year in office. Canada has committed to 3.5% by 2035, and that commitment is backed by an additional $80 billion in defense spending over 5 years announced in Budget 2025. Colby's claim that Canada failed to make credible progress on its defense commitments arrived the same week Canada was tracking at 2.1% of GDP in defense spending above the alliance threshold. And in the same month that Canada was selected as headquarters for NATO's new Defense, Security and Resilience Bank, the Saab Bombardier GlobalEye won the NATO AWACS contract, and the federal government announced $35 billion for defense and infrastructure in Canada's north. The Permanent Joint Board on Defense, which hasn't met since 2024, was established in 1940 as an advisory body for US-Canada bilateral defense cooperation. While its suspension does not affect joint military operations, it deals a symbolic blow at a time when Canada and the US are locked in a trade dispute and bilateral tensions remain elevated. That last sentence is the most important one for understanding the strategic context of both the pause and Carney's response. The PJBD is an advisory forum. Its suspension does not affect NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, through which Canada and the United States jointly monitor and respond to aerospace threats to the continent. It does not affect Canada's NATO obligations or operational defense relationships. The forum had not met since 2024 regardless. The practical operational impact of its suspension is limited. The symbolic impact an 86-year institution pause during an active trade dispute is what the announcement was designed to produce. Carney's decision not to perform an alarm in response to a symbolic gesture is itself a strategic communication. The previous Canadian posture in bilateral disputes was to treat every American pressure point as a crisis, requiring urgent diplomatic management, projecting a sense of dependence that invited further pressure. The Carney posture is different. When the US suspended the PJBD, Canada's response was to announce the largest graphite mine in the G7 in the same news cycle. When asked about Washington's symbolic pressure move, Carney noted its heritage and declined to amplify its significance. Carney said Tuesday the defense cooperation between Canada and the United States will continue, but Ottawa will also reach out to other allies to diversify defense cooperation. That sentence does the same work as everything else Carney has been doing since taking office. Canada will maintain existing relationships, and Canada will build alternatives, not as a threat, not as retaliation, but as a stated operational reality. Defense Minister David McGuinty's response when asked about the PJBD at a separate news conference in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, on Tuesday was equally revealing. He chose not to address the question directly and instead rattled off a long list of major defense spending moves Ottawa is undertaking. They include acquiring a fleet of new River-class destroyers for the Navy, shelling out tens of billions of dollars on upgrades to NORAD equipment, and planning to soon buy a new fleet of submarines. The submarine procurement is worth noting specifically. The Canadian Patrol submarine project, worth between $60 billion and $120 billion over its full life cycle, is currently a competition between South Korea's Hanwha Ocean and Germany's ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems. The decision is expected in June 2026. Neither of those two finalists is an American company. The largest defense procurement in Canadian history is being awarded to either a Korean or a German shipbuilder, and the bids were structured to maximize Canadian industrial benefit, Indigenous community engagement, and domestic defense manufacturing capacity. The PJBD pause did not change that procurement or alter the competition. Canada's largest defense acquisition of the decade has no American competitor in it. Prominent former federal Conservative MPs Erin O'Toole and Jason Kenney have both called the US move misguided and counterproductive. The cross-partisan consensus among Canadian politicians is notable. O'Toole, the former Conservative leader who might be expected to criticize the Carney government's handling of the bilateral relationship, directed his criticism at the American decision rather than at the Canadian response. When the critique of Washington's action comes from the opposition rather than the government, it signals that the political ground in Canada has shifted, that defending the bilateral relationship at any cost is no longer a viable political position on either side of the partisan divide. Carney also addressed the forward-looking question of how Canada's defense spending will reach the higher targets the government has committed to. When asked about criticism from former Parliamentary Budget Officer Kevin Page that Ottawa had not produced a clear financial plan for achieving the NATO target of 3.5% of GDP by 2035, Carney replied, "It would be premature to project that far out. The core reason is we want to spend the money well," he said. He added that modern warfare is undergoing rapid change through advances in drone technology and artificial intelligence, and that the defense spending frameworks of 5 years ago do not map onto the operational requirements of the current security environment. The PJBD has been suspended. NORAD continues. The submarine competition continues. The NORAD upgrades costing tens of billions continue. Canada's defense spending is tracking at 2.1% of GDP. The largest graphite mine in the G7 broke ground the same day Carney was asked about the pause. Canada's response to Washington's symbolic pressure was to decline to treat it as significant and then demonstrate, through the same news cycle, that Canada's strategic direction does not depend on Washington's approval to proceed.